Good morning or good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar. Thank you very much for spending time with us today. Learn more about FDICIA and SOX compliance. I'm Robert Finch, I'm the Director of Marketing and Sales for CB Resource. CB Resource is an Irvine-based provider of risk management and planning solutions for financial institutions across the United States. If your bank is considering options for ERM, strategic planning, or capital planning, we'd be grateful for the opportunity to talk with you. Today, I'm joined with my colleague and CB Resources Chief Operating Officer, Long Nguyen. Long is a former bank CFO and actively works with our clients as an advisor and subject matter expert. Having gone through the FDICIA implementation process in his banks, he is here to share his insights today during the discussion. We're also honored to have Dave Seiden and Kevin Nunes from the Navis Group join us today to share their insights into FDICIA and SOX compliance. Navis Group is based in Massachusetts and have worked with over 60 banks and audit firms and have a well-established approach to financial reporting compliance, this financial reporting compliance requirement. Navis Group and CB Resource have been referral partners for several years. Before we get started, we'll go through a few things. There is, feel free to reach out and ask questions in the chat function. We'll certainly try to get to those either during the session or as at the end. This is intended to be a working session, so please feel free to take notes. We are recording this webinar, and it will be available via a link later today, should be, or if not, first thing tomorrow. Navis Group also has written a COSO FDICIA SOX playbook, which will also will be shared with you as well there. Just an overview of the session today. We'll kind of break it out into several different parts. First will be understanding the basics of FDICIA and SOX, implementation for banks that are going through that process, as well as annual update cycle. And for banks that have been compliant for years but maybe looking to update, we'll go through that. We'll have some closing thoughts and opportunities for some questions. So without further ado, I'm gonna hand it over to you, Dave.
Okay, thank you, Robert, and thank you all for jumping in. Robert shared the registration list with me yesterday, and I know we've got a lot of familiar faces and friends out there listening in, folks that are already clients, whether it's for FDICIA, SOX, or some of the other things we do. So to the friends we know, thank you for jumping in and clicking in, and for the folks we haven't met yet, thanks for jumping in as well. We hope we can be informative and give you a sense of what we do a little bit. So I'm going to share my screen. I want to get into the sort of basics of FDICIA first here. Let me get to a full screen there, and I want to get to go. Just a second. Presentation mode, which I don't want to be. Yikes. All right, bear with me 2 seconds. I did all that work in advance, and stop my share, come back in again. I apologize for that. If I don't hit it this time, I'm just going to start speaking to it, and that'll be that. All right, so I'm going to speak to this section instead. Which I can do. So the acronyms that we wanted to cover here, FDICIA, SOX, COSO, very important to understand, ICFR, those sorts of things. So FDICIA is the rule set. When a bank hits $1 billion in assets, the rule kicks in. FDICIA is the FDIC Improvement Act of 1991, the only time you hear FDICIA and the word improvement in the same sentence often. Back in 1991, some of you may remember the call report was only 4 pages long. There wasn't a lot of information back then, and they were looking for some information. So they wanted to also make sure the banks were a little more solid in their practices and their controls back then. In 2006, that threshold went from $500 million to $1 billion, and it has stayed there to today. There have been some arguments about whether that threshold is too low and ought to be brought up a little bit further. Although some of the bank issues earlier in this year have put a real exclamation point on the necessity of good controls. So I don't think the FDIC is going to be inclined to move on that anytime soon. But FDICIA, when a bank hits $1 billion in assets, it kicks in. So Robert asked me this question yesterday: what exactly is the rule? What is the defining moment at which FDICIA kicks in? And we're going to assume here that you're a December 31st year end. Those of you who are fiscal year ends can do the mental gymnastics yourself here. But if at the end of the day on December 31st, or said differently, if you wake up on New Year's morning hungover or not, and you're over $1 billion in assets, that's your year of compliance. And the year of compliance means that if you're over $1 billion as of 12/31/23, that means that when you get to the end of 2024, your CEO and your CFO have to be able to look backwards through the entirety of the year and assert that the controls were documented, tested, in place. So it really means that if you're going to be over $1 billion as of December 31, 2023, you should have had this done by now to really be comfortable. It can be done early in 2024, but really you want to be a year ahead of it, as most of our banks have been. So that's FDICIA. It applies to the integrity of your financial statements, and financial statements defined for this purpose as your 4 call reports and your annual audited financial statements. Now, Sarbanes-Oxley is akin to this. Sarbanes-Oxley applies to stock companies. So in our world, stock banks. It's got a different threshold that kicks in a little bit sooner in terms of asset size. But it also encompasses more than just call report and annual financial statement. It encompasses the 3 Qs and a K, and optionally the proxy statement. And we would opine the proxy statement has some pretty unique financial reporting information with respect to ownership that really ought to be included, but doesn't seem to be any real chapter and verse on that. The guidance that we use for all of this comes from COSO, the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations, which isn't a very illuminative an acronym either, but it's mostly the AICPA that rules the roost there. There are some other agencies involved. AICPA does a certification in COSO, a lovely little 17-hour class that is long on philosophy and short on practicality. But I've got that credit, and if you need some CPA credits, knock yourself out, I guess. But COSO provides us the guidance, the sort of foundational pieces of what we look for here in terms of the principles and focus points that we want to consider when we think about, gee, do our financial statements have integrity? And I'll show you that a little bit when we get into the implementation part of what we're talking about here. The last acronym that's used in, well, a couple more, ICFR, Internal Controls Over Financial Reporting. Not an acronym that Kevin and I tend to throw around that just doesn't roll off the tongue as we're, having a conversation. But the audit firms will certainly use that. But it's an important concept because that really sets our scope here, that we're talking about internal controls over financial reporting. And with respect to that, we're really just looking at anything that's going to impact the integrity of those financial statements, either in a significant, well, I'll talk about significance and applicability in a minute. But it excludes compliance. So for this exercise, even though these things are really important for banks, we don't care about flood insurance. We don't care about HMDA. We don't care about SARS and money laundering. And we don't care about all of those things necessarily, that a lot of the tech security pieces. It's anything that's going to impact your financial reporting. The other piece of this, and the other acronym, of course, is the PCAOB, which is the Oversight Bureau for your friendly accounting firms. And that seems to be more where the practical guidance comes from. So as we do this work, and you all as banks do this work, and you get audited by your audit firm, your audit firm gets audited with respect to how they went about this. And PCAOB tends to let them know, hey, we want to, have a bigger focus on X, Y, or Z, and that kind of trickles down. And so, for example, we have our playbook, and we update it a couple of times a year with various topics, and we're going to be updating it with a CECL topic coming up. But we're kind of waiting to see what consensus looks like as all of your audit firms look at your CECL calculations and your CECL controls for the first time. It's all over the map. And so we're kind of waiting to see the consensus and see what that looks like going forward. So when we talk about internal controls over financial reporting, there's two very important criteria here. What applies and what's significant and what applies. And so let me start with what applies. I talked about compliance issues and all of that. We have a ton of controls around a bank. It's just the nature of the business. So an example I like to use is safe deposit boxes. Most of you have safe deposit boxes, and we've got whiz-bang controls around safe deposit boxes, right? There's a log, I can't get behind the teller line to wherever the safe deposit box vault is. I need to be accompanied. There needs to be a dual key thing going on. So we're very, very tightly controlled around that. That has nothing to do with financial reporting. So our controls there are off the table for FDICIA. You don't throw those controls away. FDICIA is a subset of your overall control structure. You need to remember that as you think about this. But we do bill for safe deposit boxes, don't we? So it does hit your financial statements at the end of the day, but then we have to apply that significance test and say, okay, but is that really significant? And when we think about significant, I would say, gee, if we forgot to bill safe deposit boxes for a month or for a whole quarter, would we restate our call reports? And the answer is no, we would not. We would just pick that up the next quarter. It's one of those insignificant whoops kind of moments, right? That I don't think would happen anyway. But those sorts of things, don't reach significance levels for the financial statements. The other thing I like to add at this point is sort of the roles that are played here, because this all has to be tested, and I'll go through that a little bit before we're done. But who owns this in a bank? Well, at the end of the day, it's the CFO. It's the CFO and the CEO that really sign off on it, but it's the CFO. This is an exercise in controls over the financial statements. This is not a risk thing. This is not an internal audit thing. This is about the CFO identifying the controls that let him or her sleep at night, knowing everything is tight. Now, can the CFO delegate the management of this project to who he or she would like to? Well, yes, of course. And so often we see the head of internal audit or the head of risk, or in a lot of cases, the controller or someone else in the financial group as the owner or as the project manager. We have a particular affinity to it staying in the accounting group because it is just about the financial reporting. And so risk people, with all due respect, think and speak risk speak and look at it a little differently. And internal audit looks at it a little differently as well. But there's no rule set. Different people can manage the project. And of course, it depends on the time available, in the bank. So that's the ownership. But we're going to identify controls, but whoever's in charge of deposit ops or wherever, or e-banking or treasury, where your wire transfers get done, your CFO may have very little line of sight into the controls over how we do a wire. And so we have control owners who know those things inside and out, and they're going to be helpful in identifying these controls, but also in signing off as control owners. So there's a bit of a roll up of these controls to the top. When we do these projects, and we've done more than 60 projects, successful FDICIA implementations. So the old expression is it ain't bragging if it's true. And so, we think we've got this nailed down, and that we've got an approach that that works, and that will pass muster. But there are three distinct roles here. And I want to spend a moment on that, and then I'm going to show you what a set of documentation, at least from the way we do things, looks like. There's the implementation phase of this, where we have to identify these controls, articulate these controls, articulate what the auditable evidence might be, what the characteristics of these controls are, what the purpose of these controls are, what's the end point of this control, why are we doing this? So there's a lot of articulation there. And as you do that, the implementation piece, it has a big dose of, do we have all the controls we need, or are these designed properly to guard against what we think we're guarding against? Do we have too many cooks spoiling the broth, or do we have not enough cooks for segregation of duties? So we really want to look at the controls. So somebody implements this. That's the role we always take on. Then this needs to be tested. All these controls need to be tested. Testing is different than internal audit. In internal audit, we're looking to see that the transaction was correct, that it flowed all the way through. When we test our controls, we're myopically looking at the control point, right? Do we always do a wire transfer with a wire transfer form with an approval attached to it? If the wire's going to North Korea, that's a bad thing. But the control itself is looking at, do we always, and never miss it, that we're going to use the form, because this is an exercise in zero tolerance. If we say we have controls, we have to be able to assert that they are sacred. So somebody needs to test that. Now, who can test that? That can be done internally by your internal audit group. If you have one, it can be done, sometimes it's done within a risk group, because it's really not an audit. A risk group can go in and look at these, or it can be your outsourced internal audit a group. And that's what we see more often than not these days. And then over and above that, we have external audit coming in and opining on the whole shebang. Was it scoped out properly? Did you do all the testing? Were there problems? Did the documentation, clearly capture what it should have captured? I mentioned the three roles because there's been a blurring of lines a little bit in the past couple of years that I find bothersome. I'm a longstanding CPA. I'm kind of on the back nine at this point, but I take these rules very, very carefully. We're finding some firms that'll do implementation and testing. In fact, we've had some RFPs issued that say you can only bid in if you'll do both. We cannot do both. There's a conflict of interest. We have a vested interest in the outcome. And I've researched this a couple of times with the AICPA and their code of ethics, because, if the rules have changed, boy, I'd love to add some testers and make some more money, but we can't do it. We just can't do it. We have to hold that line of integrity. But we've lost 2 bids in the past year to firms who will do both. And it's a funny thing, because this whole FDICIA thing, SOX thing, the whole COSO thing, the very first principle is integrity. This is an exercise in integrity, and to kind of throw that out the window before you even get going, I find a little hard to swallow. So let me show you now what.
Hey Dave, I have a question actually. So so when you talk about those control and the reliance on those controls and the testing of those controls, let's just say you test a control, and then let's say you do a random sample, and then you pick a control, and then you do you pull 5 of those, wires. Let's just say one of them fails. What happens? What happens next? If let's say one of the controls just fail, and you're
That's
trying
a
to
good
rely on that
question.
control.
That's a good question because I haven't gotten into the sample sizes yet, but wires are done multiple times a day. And so if you're testing that wire form, let's use that as the control point, you're going to test 40 of those in a year. And you're going to test 10 from each quarter, right? We need to make sure that the controls are working all year. So if 1 out of 40 fails, it gets you an F. It doesn't get you an A minus, first of all. But testing can go back and look at there's two ways this fails. Testing can go back and say, well, what happened there? Was this a problem? Was this a circumvention of the rules? Did we lose that wire form? Maybe we did it and we lost it. It didn't get filed properly. So things can happen. And if a firm can go back in, but they'll need to retest and make sure there are no other errors. The wire transfer is the classic Enron situation, right? For SOX, that Mr. Lay would come in at the end of the day and say, send that wire, I'll get you the form tomorrow. And he never got you the form tomorrow, right? So we don't want any of that going on. But yeah, it's an exercise in zero tolerance. But the other way these controls fail, especially in the first year or maybe 2, is if we say that we've got to control investments, making new investments, bond investments, then only the CFO and controller can make these decisions and sign off on a new CUSIP that we're buying. Well, sure as shooting, the audit sample is going to find the one day the CEO did it. And so our control description might say it can only be the CFO or controller. But if we go back to the investment policy, it might be that the CEO is also empowered to do that. He just never does, or she never does. So it can be a failure of language, and then you can just adjust the language that, okay, we got that wrong when we put that together. And that happens in the first couple of years. So yeah, thank you. That's great.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. All right. So let me, I'm going to try and share my screen and make it work this time. I'm going to go over to the guidance, to the Smartsheet that we use. We use Smartsheet to do this. We had done this in Excel for 1,000 years, and we moved over to Smartsheet. Now we have to, when we're mapping our controls or we're thinking about a control structure, it has to map to the COSO guidance, right? Or we want to at least demonstrate that we're using the COSO guidance, but it also has to map to the financial statements, as I mentioned, the call reports, the financial statements. So what we've built in Smartsheet is we've started with the 17 COSO principles, first one being integrity, as I mentioned, and we've built in all the focus points under integrity being tone at the top demonstrated, ethical standards defined and evaluated, and conduct deviations addressed. There's a lot of wording around that. Further in our Smartsheet, we've built in a lot of the language. So as we're thinking about these things and we're talking to a bank, this is just our prompt in terms of, well, what was COSO trying to get at with respect to this focus point or principle? So that's just sort of background guidance for us. But where the rubber hits the road for us is we have a control analysis. So let me jump down an example here. This is what our documentation and what a lot of your documentation looks like, right? A lot of you who have done this forever, it's in Excel. The Excel spreadsheets look a lot like this. So in a lot of cases, we've got a codification for these things, a control name, a control description, what the auditable evidence is. I'll show you the pieces of the puzzle. But what we're looking at here is when we think about the COSO guidance, and I've bumped down here to principle 10, which is the operating environment. And that's where all of our day-to-day controls end up. And so we're mapping to financial statements, but this care of feeding of the GL is basic reporting things. So just as a very quick example, general ledger access is key, right? So before anybody can impact our financial statements, you got to get into the system. So we're looking for a control there around who says who can go in and who has which rights to do what. And so we'll have a control over that entry point. Further along in our tech controls, we'll have an annual, semi-annual review of user provisions to see who's in there. So we'll we'll write that up, what does this bank do? What's the auditable evidence, so on and so forth. But then this is such a good example because when we walk into a bank, half of the banks at $1 billion, when we ask, when you update your chart of accounts, how formal a process do you have? Is that a wink and a nod? If I go over to my controller, Kevin, and say, Kevin, add an account for FDICIA consultants, and it'll be that, just use the next number that comes up. So that's a wink and a nod, and he does it. How formal is that process? Maybe that's okay, but we have a lot of banks that have a form that says, boy, Dave's as CFO is approving that. Kevin or somebody in the accounting group is inputting that and checking that. So at that point, we're going to go through and say, gee, this is one we ought to do. And we have got about 350 controls built into this template. Typical banks can end up with about 100, 125 perhaps. And so we've got a little bit of just a checkbox thing that we've got, for example, the chart of accounts changes. We had lit that up as, that's something the bank ought to consider. If it's something the bank has, we're going to light that up, and that's what we do. So we'll come down and how do we do general journal entries? Well, we do them that way, or we do them that way. And there's a lot of discussion around this. I'm giving this very short shrift in the interest of time. By the way, out on our website, we have 3 webinars that Kevin and I recorded during COVID that they're each about 45 minutes, and they cover in much more detail what we have here in our playbook is going to give this to you as well. But the documentation, let me go across the top. Smartsheet, instead of having columns A, B, C, D, they go with column headers. So we're always going to have a control name, our control description, which is a bit of a control narrative, right? How does this really work? We're going to be more specific about the auditable evidence. And in recent years, not in this template, we've added what the control point really is, what the control frequency is. How often does this happen? This is something that happens once a year, once a quarter. Our wire transfer example is long asked. We do that multiple times a day. So we know what the annual sample size. We have a suggestion here. Every audit firm's a little bit different. We always assign a control owner and a task performer. Whose neck is in the noose if this comes off the rails, but who really does this day to day, right? Accounts payable is a good example. CFO or controller probably owns it, but an accounts payable clerk or technician is the one that's really doing it day to day. We always look at key control considerations. We've got, what we like about Smartsheet is if you've got a drop-down box, you can choose a bunch of them. So is this about authorization? Is this about segregation of duties, dual controls, the various control points? And then if there are key system dependencies, we're going to identify those across. But then we also, as part of the exercise about are these controls, operating the way we want, are they sufficient? We're going to look at control characteristics. What's the risk if this control fails? Right? These are all key to financial reporting. But to Long's question, if the wire transfer control fails, that's a big deal. That's a high risk. There are a lot of things that carry the FAS label, like the FAS 310, whatever, or the old FAS 91, right? For deferred costs on loans. If that fails, it's a no big deal. So it's a pretty low risk, but it's still part of our financial reporting package. We're going to identify whether the control is designed to guard against internal fraud, yes or no, external fraud, yes or no, if it's preventive or detective, if it's a manual or auto. And then there are some control reporting characteristics that we identify as well. So at the end of the day, we end up with, we go through and we identify. And as we do, we end up with a control list that looks something like this. And this is a bank we did up in Maine. This is just the control names, but we end up with a control compendium that in investments is a good example. What are our controls around the whole investment process? And part of our process, we also have control objectives. So under investments, we have 4 objectives: everything authorized okay, everything executed okay, everything safe kept okay, everything valued okay. And if we've got controls for each of those control objectives, then we've got it. And so we're just sort of hanging all of those on that control tree, if you will. So with that, I'm going to stop the share, and I can come back to questions later. But I want to turn this over to Kevin. I'm going to mute myself in a second, because the next part of this is we want to talk about, we've got it implemented, and boy, that was short shrift. We're happy to share this one-on-one at any time with you. Or again, please go out to our website. But then this is the gift that keeps on giving. Once you're FDICIA or SOX, you're always FDICIA or SOX.
Yep. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for the time this afternoon. So as Dave mentioned, the implementation of this, particularly for banks that have never had it before, as opposed to a larger bank that might need to revisit their controls because they might have done it under the old schema, and there's a different way to do it, and you can oftentimes pare down that control list dramatically, big savings in testing costs and overhead. So once the implementation is done, and particularly in the first few years, you're going to find that as testing comes in, and I will talk a little bit about the testing cadence that we typically see. There's going to always be a need to refine and update, right? It's like a bit like a strategic plan. You don't just do a strategic plan and then set it aside, and then 3 years later, because someone expects to see an updated plan, you pull it off and you do another one, and then you set that aside for 3 years. These have to be tested. These controls have to be tested every year. And things are going to change. New systems, if you are only using Fedline right now, for example, to do wire transfers, you decide, we're going to go to WITS or Payments Exchange or eWire. It's going to affect a handful of the controls. You implement a Resi LOS where one might not have been before, a commercial LOS, whatever it happens to be. Things are going to change. Banks, like anything else, you're always looking for process improvement, better tools to do things. And so you have to be, there's a bit of a cultural thing that has to happen within the organization, so that the control owners understand, as they're constantly seeking for better ways to do things, they have to be mindful of how that spills over into the control structure. As well, certainly again, assuming a calendar year, folks, for year end, typically what we see with our client base is they get their audit commentary late February, early March, when the financials are done, right? The 800-pound gorilla in the room with FDICIA SOX is you have to get the opinion from the external audit firm that you have the system of controls in place that ensure the integrity of the financials. So obviously, that's the opinion that you want to get. And oftentimes you will find that you'll have some commentary from your auditors. Once that's in hand, that's typically when we like to kick off our update cycle. And the way that we do that is to revisit all of the controls, and also address any audit concerns that popped up when external came in to do their thing so that they could render their opinion. And so mid-ish to late spring into maybe late spring, early summer is where we would suggest you consider doing sort of that global update. Now, of course, when you're, during the course of an entire year, if late in the year something changes because, again, you've changed a process, you need to be diligent about that. But we like to do the global update fairly early in the year, and we do that with the timing, not just because of the having the audit commentary that we've received or the bank has received, but also because we typically see from a testing cadence cycle that a testing firm will do its work first, maybe around the mid-year point, where they'll look at the first 2 quarters of the year. And then maybe around mid to latter October, they might come in and look at the 3rd quarter of the year. And then sometime before year end, they'll look at the 4th quarter of the year. And so as changes are happening, as controls need to be tightened up, we want to be ahead of the testing cycle so that, a control that reads, well, this is the way it's always been, but now effective with some change at June 30th, from July 1st forward, there's a different process around it. There's a different piece of auditable evidence. We want to make sure that's clean before they come in and give you a fail that's not a fail because you forgot to tell them, oh, we're just doing it differently, and now we document it differently. And documentation on controls, by the way, is everything. You can say that you did something a certain way. If you can't document it, that's going to look like a fail. And so a lot of what we do in our implementations, a lot of best practice conversation about how things can be done, but because we get to share what we've learned from 60 banks as opposed to folks going into the same bank every day. But at the end of the day, a lot of times the so-called deficiencies in the control environment that we're finding aren't really that there's a control missing. It's not being properly documented. But again, to a little bit of an aside, but overall, from that annuality standpoint, it's going to be, suggest consideration of a sort of overall global update, and then as well, sort of getting your control owners to understand the cultural aspect of needing to always be wary of changes that they make, hopefully improvements, and whether or not they spill into the controls that and require control updates.
Okay, Kevin and I are trying to be careful across the table from one another, muting and unmuting so we don't kill you with feedback if we're both on at the same time. We had a pretty horrendous test before you all came on, so I think we've saved your ears. The last thing we want to talk about, and then take some questions a little bit here, and thank you, Kevin, for that. Certainly the implementation piece, the update piece, we're not kind of talking about the methodology so much, the walkthroughs we do. And again, our playbook, the other videos we have can help you with that, or certainly you can reach out. We're trying to give this a quick overview of the various pieces of this. But the last part of the puzzle here is that many of you in excess of $1 billion, $2 billion, $3 billion, $10 billion have been doing this for a long time. And how we approached this 10 or 12 or 15 years ago, and I've been doing this a long time, it's how I would have approached it years ago. We used to map out the control. We used to do the flowchart diagrams and all of that. And, I've put away my little plastic protractors and I've put away my Microsoft Visio program because we don't do that anymore. I think we've all gotten to the point where just identifying the control points and the endpoints. But a lot of you in bigger banks, and we about once or twice a year, will end up doing what we call a refresh for a bigger bank. Well, banks come in that are testing 500, 600, 700 controls. And when really 125 or 150 maybe for a big bank is going to suffice. And the old argument was, well, what's the big deal if we overdo it a bit? Isn't that better? No, it's not, because there's a really significant cost to testing all of these. When we have a new bank come and ask us about testing, although we don't do the testing, we refer to firms. We do know that the external audit firms use a metric of typically 2 hours per control per year. So if you've got 125 controls, you've got 250 additional testing hours that you're going to pay for at whatever their rate is. You've got 500 controls. You don't want to be paying somebody to test those if you don't have to do that. So that's a big deal. And the old matrices and approach that folks took were really bottom up as opposed to this top down from the COSO guidance and from the financial statements. And the bottom up was departmental. So it used to be deposit ops, go identify all your controls, loan ops, do yours, accounting, do yours, tech, do yours. They'd all come up with their own matrix. Way overscoped, many things that don't apply, and tremendous redundancy. What's one of our key controls? Our Fed recon. We're doing a Fed recon every day. Maybe it doesn't get reviewed every day, but we're doing it every day. And we would have 8 departments identify that as a key control, right? If I'm on wires, the Fed recon is pretty important. If I'm in investments, Fed recon is pretty important. And so it would be in there 8 times, and it would be tested 8 times, for the various pieces of the puzzle. So when you extract all of that extraneous stuff and you get down to, what applies and what doesn't, So we did one this year, just finished it. And boy, is it hard after you've used that and been at that scope for years, 550 controls, for especially the accounting group or whoever owns this internal audit, managing it, to get their arms around, well, what do you mean I can't, you're cutting these out, you're gutting my control structure. No, we're not. They're all good controls. You got to keep doing all that stuff. We're just trying to get to the set that you want to look at. So we had a bank this year that 550 controls coming in. We eliminated 460 of those as redundant combinations, didn't apply, insignificant, all the factors that I've mentioned. So 550 down to 90. And then we added the 45 things that were missing. In the 550, they were missing. They never approved an accounts payable invoice. It never got onto the matrix. There were some incredible gaps of things that what do you, so because the department never thought about it in terms of it being important to this process. So we had all that extraneous crap, technical term, and then we missed a bunch of things. So getting it to that. So we love doing those projects. Quick sales pitch. The payback on that is 12 to 18 months because we're saving so much money on the testing cost and at the end of the day, making everybody's life that much easier. We come off as heroes when we do that. So we always feel pretty good about those projects. So that's really important to really look at that as a refresh every now and then. Thankfully, the external audit firms are starting to look at that and say, gee, guys, you're over scope. Maybe you want to go back and take a look at it. And whether you use somebody like us or just go through a different lens and look at it, it's pretty important that you do that. So, and again, just getting it mapped, the old processes or the old matrices that we used, again, departmental matrices, and then you'd have to map those to the COSO principles and ended up with another blanket-sized Excel spreadsheet with all the columns for all the focus points. Then you'd have to map it to the financial statements, and you'd end up with another blanket-sized Excel sheet, as opposed to our approach that we're kind of flipping it on its head and doing it frontwards instead of backwards, in my view, that we're starting with the COSO guidance and then, adding financial statement order to that, and then, hanging the ornaments on that tree. I guess 'tis the season. I'll use that analogy a couple of weeks ahead of Christmas here. So that's kind of again, very quick look at this, what the rule set is, how you implement it, how you keep it updated. If you've been there for a long time, take another look at it because, I think you have a chance to save yourself some grief and some money. And both of those things are pretty good. So with that, boy, I think we did pretty well on time here. So with that, any questions? Long, anything you'd like to add to that? I know Long has been through this at a couple of banks. So he's been I was going to say victim, but he's been a participant in a lot of these before. So anything you would add to that from your perspective?
No, I think you brought up a great point there, Dave, in terms of just doing the implementation and, the conflict of interest there, that not to do the testing, and I think you kind of elaborate on just maybe some referrals, but there's a lot of efficiencies to be doing that as well as to get in-house to do some testing as well, or to rely on some other testing but if you could elaborate a little bit more on that piece as well in terms of, what should the bank do? I mean, if they got 500, control points and then they can't rely on you to test, what would be some of your additional suggestions there?
Sure. Yeah, let me do that. And then there was a question in the Q&A that I'll address too. I want to make sure we get to everybody's thoughts. So yeah, so the bigger banks, again, the couple of examples we've had, what we've found is that the documentation from the departmental approach has been really tough to follow. And so there's a lot of, some of the controls are sort of like the run-on sentences that our old English teachers used to beat us up about, where it's really 6 controls in one, or maybe there's 5 control points and 3 of them are good. And then there are others that are like just a single nugget of what is really a bigger control, and you need to get at it. So it's a big jigsaw puzzle to try and bring backwards, but it's, is this a control that has too much in it that needs to be split into many? And then you can look at what's significant and what applies. Or do we have 6 controls here that are really part of a narrative that really only ends up at a final point of a sign off? So all of that language is good, but the auditable evidence or the control point is really just that last thing. And so the combination kind of comes together here. There's also been a bit of a move, at least as we've done things, that there are certain things that we can assert versus test. So in the olden days, we used to always test that we had board minutes. You know damn well you have board minutes. You pull them off the shelf every time an auditor walks in, right? Every time, any stripe of auditor walks in. So testing that internally in a bank to see that you've got board minutes is kind of dumb. And there's a bunch of stuff like that we can just assert. And so I think it's harder. I find the refresh projects getting a big bank resized so much more difficult than a bank, just hitting $1 billion, and we're identifying things fresh. We're starting with a bit of a fresh canvas. And I'll tell you, the documentation in the bigger banks gets away from us too. This one we just did, the matrices that we looked at for these 500 controls, 550, told half the story, because the other half of the story was sitting over in the audit work papers. So there was no single place that you could look to get the whole control thing. It was all there, but very, very inefficient. So let me hit 2 questions if I can in the interest of time.
Thank you, Dave.
Yep, thank you. And I won't name names here if they came in through the box, so we'll leave one person said anonymous attendee, so there you go. But I do have a question, bank that says we are first year FDICIA because we were over $1 billion at 12/31/22, but we're now back under $1 billion. Do we continue testing and updating our FDICIA controls? Yes, you do. So again, once FDICIA, always FDICIA, and you're going to be over $1 billion again. So you don't want to leave this on the shelf, let it get dusty, because it changes, right? This is the one thing you can count on here is that it won't stay the same, because you're going to change payroll providers. You're going to add a commercial LOS system. You're going to add a workflow to accounts payable. You're going to change your core system. You're going to have a new CFO come in and change some processes. So it always changes as we go. So you're going to want to keep that up to date. Second question was, is there a typical number of employees per control area that are a good rule of thumb? Not really. It's not really a head count kind of thing. And let's see, what's a good example? The sort of deposit ops back office, when we look at wires and we look at file maintenance and we look at rate changes and we look at dormant accounts and the controls over all those things, we might end up with 10 or 12 controls in the deposit ops area. And so when we're going through our walkthroughs, we might have 3 or 4 folks from the department. Maybe it's the deposit ops manager that owns all of that. But it's really not a head count kind of thing so much. But interesting question. It also, in years gone by, people used to say, gee, we're going to hit FDICIA. We're going to need an extra, 1.5 FTEs to manage this damn thing. You don't. At 1.25, you really don't, if it's scoped correctly. So, and then third question here, can you elaborate a bit on a paired control and the role of a paired control? Yeah, so you picked that up as I went through, quickly, that listening that we did. So, really important question, and thank you. So there's a 1 to many, many to 1 relationship of these controls. So I gave the example of the Fed recon, that kept showing up and it was redundant. So in our approach, we certainly need to identify that Fed recon as a key control and test test it mightily. Make sure that's in place. That's a really important one. But once identified, that control satisfies or is part of the backbone for a lot of other areas. So if we identify that control in the accounting group for, as part of their recon process, a daily, monthly, quarterly recon process, we're going to cite that again over in investments, over in deposit ops, probably over in lending again, wherever it appears in the treasury group, cash management group. And so that's where we kind of say that's a paired control, right? So this also relies on the control that we've already done. I showed you general ledger access. When we get to the area where we're talking about just making a journal entry, how do we do it? What's that segregation of duties, that doer and reviewer sign off if I'm going to do a journal entry? So we've got a good control around that, but a paired control there is one we've already identified, and that's access to the GL. I can't do a journal entry unless I'm in it. Or I can't do it unless I have access to wherever that journal entry is happening. I know on some of your core systems, the operating units, are able to make journal entries. So we have to, watch for that control. So it's that many to one, one to many relationship that we identify it in the place it lives and where it's owned. And then we look at, where else does that kick in? So I hope that sort of answers your question there. Many of our, and you're welcome. And many of our policies are like that. So paired control, what are the controls around authorizing a new investment? Great. We're going to want to see some pre-purchase analysis signed off by the CFO maybe. But the investment policy is a paired control for that, right? The investment policy is guiding that activity, that control, how that control is designed, who's authorized to actually do that. So again, paired controls, one to many, many to one. So that's how we've conquered that. We've struggled with what to call that over the years. Is it a complementary control? Is it a supplemental control? And I think paired is kind of what we've settled in on as our nomenclature. That's what we call it. Another provider might call it something different. So you may hear it said differently. So I want to clue you into that as well. So other questions? We've come up on 252. Yeah. No. Do I have one more there? Oh, yes, I do. Let's see, quite a bit of discussion around surprise cash counts done in the branches as a key control. I would begin to call it a paired control. Would that be fair? I would call that an insignificant control. I would call that insignificant because if we did a cash count and we found an error and all of the cash in that branch were missing, is that a moment by which we would restate the call report? Or we would pick that up the next quarter? You think of the amount of cash we keep in branches. So it's really, really important, right? Because it's a big deal if a teller's off $1,000. But think about a $1 billion bank. For a $1 billion bank, that's really not significant. The total amount of cash in any one vault would probably not be significant. So we have never cited cash counts as one of our controls, and every one of the probably dozen audit firms across the country we've worked with have never called us on that. So last one, there are two parts of the SOX control exercise, the SOX control matrix, the smart sheet. Oh, and the narrative describing and providing color to the control environment. May you elaborate? Yeah, so this is from a client that knows this. So thank you, Martin, for that prompt. So the second part where I mentioned that we can assert certain things as opposed to testing them. And, I mentioned, we no longer look for testing the existence of, minutes to the board meetings or an org chart or things like that. But COSO starts with the very first principle of integrity. And the first focus point is tone from the top. How the heck do you test that? right? And that's cultural, that's anecdotal. And so the narrative that Martin mentions in his question here is that we'll put together anecdotally, how does the bank's culture answer this question of do we have good tone from the top? And there's a lot of evidence for that. It could be in your code of ethics, your code of conduct, your whistleblower policy or practice is part of that. Your employee handbook may speak to that. One of your core values may be integrity. And maybe one of the components of your performance review is integrity. Perhaps when you do onboarding of new employees, that's an important part of what we always say and do. We have a CEO in Maine that always sits with new employees on their first day, and he told us that's one of the first lessons that he imparts is integrity is job one. It's a big part. And I know, I'm a longstanding banker. I started as a director, and my very first night as a director, and we did our meetings in the evening, the chairman, who was an elderly gentleman, looked at me, said, there's just two things you need to know about banking: doing the right things and doing things right. And that speaks to integrity. He didn't use the words integrity. He didn't use the magic word integrity, but the message was there. So we would, we pick all of that up. So, COSO has all of those sort of qualitative issues with respect to corporate governance, with respect to succession planning, with respect to the competency and the adequacy of your accounting group. You could be cited for not having enough people in your accounting group because how you doing segregation of duties if you don't have enough body count there, especially if somebody's sick or, on medical leave or what have you. So there's a lot of pieces to that. Fraud and risk come in that way, that we're asserting that we have a fraud program, a compliance program, what have you. Doesn't necessarily apply directly to financial reporting, but it gets pretty close to the edge of that. So thank you for all those questions. So any others? Robert, I don't want to overstep my time here.
Dave, we got a few more minutes, so we'll give some opportunity. But while we're to anybody that may have any additional questions, but I do want to, on behalf of CB Resource, I do want to thank you both for being here and giving those great explanations. Obviously, if anybody has a need for the services of the Navis Group, feel free to reach out to them directly, or you can reach out to us, and we'll be happy to pass that information along. Likewise, when it comes to enterprise risk management or strategic capital planning, we'd love the chance to talk with you about that. I will be sending out an email with a link to this video that you can share with colleagues, as well as a link to Navis's COSO playbook. So be on the lookout for that, and we hope that we'll be in touch with you in the near future. Anything else?
And with respect to our playbook, we do update that maybe 2 or 3 times a year as topics come up. I mentioned CECL is going to be a thing we're going to have to address in the new year. We're just waiting to see what the consensus looks like from the audit firms. Some of them have lost their minds and others have stayed calm about it. And so we're kind of waiting to see what that looks like. But we update that, a couple of times. So you can check regularly. That's out on our website as a download at any moment. There's also a slide deck out there, which is sort of aimed at your directors or audit committees to do education around that. So grab that if you'd like. But I also, when we do an update, I typically announce it on LinkedIn. So I would invite any of you who are not linked to Kevin and I to please reach out, because that way you would get the announcement that the new version is out. And a lot of times we're tweaking language, but sometimes we're adding topics to it. And again, CECL is a great example of that. Kevin, are you going to write that? I don't want to write that.
Well, I think
Maybe long. You want to ghost write? So we don't have to.
Well, I guess.
All right. Well, thank you.
We'll conclude with that. Well, thank you, everybody, and we appreciate your time, and look forward to further webinars in our webinar series. And have a nice rest of your day.
Oh, and Robert, before they go, someone said, what's the website? It's Navis, NAVIS-group.com.
There you
Okay, thank you.
go. All right. Thanks so much.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everybody.